you can see incredibly large on the screen, we are in the book of Isaiah. I did forget my glasses again tonight, so I might have to leave everything that big before we're done. But anyway, it's good to see everybody. We're in Isaiah chapter 8. And so if you want to open your Bibles to chapter 8, we're not, at least I am not, if there are questions, specific questions, things that you want to address, questions you may have, I'll pause and stop and I'll address anything in the chapter that you want to, but I'm not going necessarily verse by verse by verse by verse, word by word, line by line, and we're trying to get big picture here. We're trying to figure out what is it that Isaiah is being told by Jehovah to convey to the people. What instructions is he being given? How is he supposed to deliver this message? Why is he supposed to deliver this message? We're trying to get that kind of imagery from the testimony of the prophet, and so we've been kind of looking at it from that standpoint and a little bit what we might call big picture approach towards the chapter and chapters as we've been going through, and so that's kind of where we're going to find ourselves. Again, I gave you a big booklet outline. That's for you to use. That's for you to help you when you're at home reading through the narratives and studying the various texts, to give you a little bit of extra understanding of what's going on in the book. I am not using that line by line by line either. I'm just trying to give you as much as I can to just give you some help as you study at home. Then when we come in on Wednesdays, I'll break down the big picture of the text as we work through it. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And here we are in Isaiah chapter 8. If you notice in those first 4 verses, and that's kind of the first pocket of verses that we want to look at, he basically says you're going to have a what? You're going to have a son, and before that son even knows how to cry, before he even figures out how to cry, I will let Assyria take the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria. In fact, the child's name is going to be synonymous with what? That was in your outline if you read it. The spoil, right? His name is going to reference the idea of the spoil and the things that were going to occur as in relationship to that. So basically, he's trying to get them to see that it's not going to be very what? It's not going to be very long, right? It's not going to be very long before these events begin to start to occur. This judgment that's on its way is coming, and we're not talking about centuries later. We're talking about very soon this judgment of God is approaching. He's kind of uses some interesting descriptive language to illustrate that, and talking about this son that he would have, and the name that son was supposed to wear, and what the meaning of that name was, and those kinds of things there at the outset. So he basically sets the time period in which this judgment of God is going to occur. By doing that, he continues in the text in verse 5 and starts talking about this complaining and resistance that the people had towards Jehovah. In fact, he says, because the people resisted the water, the provisions of God, and chose an allegiance with whom? With Israel, right? And the ruler over, the king over Israel. Israel had done left whom? God. For a long period of time. Israel has already left God and didn't even have a single ruler, a single king over them that even was concerned about what God thought about much of anything. And here are this remnant, here's this small piece of people, Judah, who have this special relationship with God, as once in a while they'll get a king that leads them in the right direction. They've been this somewhat remnant for God off and on throughout their history. And now Isaiah is being told to warn them, listen, your provisions don't come from whom? Israel or anyone else. Those provisions come from Jehovah. And God's eventually going to send the Assyrians against Judah as well, because just as Israel had abandoned God and their connectivity to Him, Judah is following that same pathway. And so judgment's coming. And again, we have read that and repeated that and studied that in the first 7 chapters over and over again. It's been the central theme and messaging of the entire book thus far. I want you to notice specifically, though, verses 8 through 10 with me. He said, and he shall pass through Judah he shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck. And the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land. O Emmanuel. And remember, that's basically a hint towards whom? Jesus, right? The ultimate benefit, the God with us. But that idea of God with us has both specific connotation when you look ahead to Jesus, and it has immediate strength and encouragement with the idea that God is with us, right? He's with us. And so Isaiah here is giving a twofold message, if you will. It's a glimpse into the future of when God will literally be with them in Emmanuel. And we talked about those prophecies concerning Jesus, and we read some of those New Testament texts last week when we reminded us of how they had been told that God would bring forth a child through a virgin, and they would call his name Emmanuel, which is interpreted God with us. And we've kind of already looked at that idea thus far. He just reminds them of that in this moment as well. Associate yourselves, O you people, and ye shall be broken in pieces. And give ear, all ye of far countries. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand, for God is with us. And what we just simply need to appreciate is, no matter what anyone may believe they can accomplish in overpowering or overwhelming what God's purposes and desires are, will they be successful? No. Gird yourselves, he said. You want to take on God, then you better be ready for that. Because those who challenge him don't generally come out the other side of that healthy. Generally speaking, well, in fact, all the time, people, when they challenge Jehovah, eventually that creates challenge and consequence. And so Isaiah is being personally reminded. We'll see that more before the chapter's over, by the way, in more detail. But he's being personally reminded he needs to stay the course, but he's got to encourage the people to do the same. Lots of temptations would come for them to think that they needed to build alliances with Israel or other nations. And all the while, the oddity of it all is God's basically saying, listen, here's what I want you to do. Nothing. Sit there and accept the judgment. That's what I want you to do. Because you can't stop it even if you wanted to. And the more you resist, the more you what? You suffer, the more you prolong it. Just accept the fact that I've determined that you need a judgment. It's coming by the way of hands that you might not have expected. But it's coming nonetheless. And the more you challenge my judgment, God says, the more painful it'll be. And so don't look for alliances. Don't deny what God is saying. Don't overreach. Just accept the fact that the judgment of God is coming. And so long as they'll do that, God will be what? God will be with them. He'll be with them even through the challenges of the conquering nation that's coming to bring them into captivity for a period of time. Questions or anything up to and through verses 10? Again, I'm looking big picture. Okay, so in verses 11 through 15, it's interesting because here is where the prophet gets some personal admonitions. Great lesson here, by the way, and in some ways I could just pause here and we could talk about this concept the rest of the night. I won't. You can, but I won't. But here's this interesting thought. Even great men like Isaiah, even men of God who have been given and assigned very peculiar and special purposes and functions for the Lord, can still be susceptible to what? Temptation and challenges, right? Isaiah is still, at the end of the day, though being given great responsibilities, he's still a what? He's still a man. He's still a man who's just as human as the next guy. And he's going to have to endure a lot. He's going to hear a lot of chatter during a pretty long span of time that he prophesies, right? How many kings does he span? 4. The end of one, throughout another 2, and at the beginning of yet another. His prophecies go forth throughout that entire time span of those kings. So throughout that period of time, he's going to be questioned and challenged and lured into thinking differently about many of the things that God was trying to get him to do and the people to do. And so God personally admonishes him. And the text says, with a what kind of hand? And I'm giving it to you, by the way. With a strong hand, the text says, right? If you see danger ahead of somebody, right? And you're trying to keep, you see them about to, step into a big hole or something. They're not paying attention, or they don't see some obstacle in their way. What kind of hand do you use to stop them from stepping into that danger? A strong hand, right? You grab them, right? You do your best to grab them and hold on to them and make sure that they don't make that mistake. That's the imagery here. God's putting his strong hand on Isaiah and saying, listen, I need you to listen to the testimony and the law and the message that I'm providing for you, and you need to follow my path and not the path of the people. When they may have some pretty persuading arguments why you should listen to them rather than what I've shared with you. And so the strong hand of the Lord hits him. Keep in mind, there's lots of nuances here, right? You've got the spiritual side of things that because they have this connectivity to God, and so there's a spiritual connection that they needed to appreciate. But they're also a what in terms of a people? They're a physical nation, right? They're a physical nation with kings and rulers and people in charge and various people in authority. And if those authority figures are saying, all right, folks, we need to align ourselves. We need to have a confederacy, or some translations even use the conspiracy. We need to have a confederacy with some other nations in order that we might defeat the Assyrians, even though God said, sit back and accept your judgment and punishment that's coming from them. And it may be viewed by many in Isaiah's time as treasonous for him to resist and fight against the ruling powers who were telling the people otherwise. Here's Isaiah being this message of the voice of God, and he's delivering the genuine testimony of God. All the while, the people in charge are saying the exact opposite. And his life very well is in danger as he speaks against what they're desiring to do, a people that are bent on ignoring the judgment of God and trying to resist this Assyrian judgment that God is using. So Isaiah, there are going to be lots of reason for you to be afraid of the people. There are going to be all kinds of reasons for you to want to maybe think differently, behave differently, change the message, acquiesce, compromise on what God has said. Don't. The strong hand of the Lord is on you. Don't. But back to my original thought, I want us to appreciate that here's a great man who needs reminded. And if great men like Isaiah, the great prophet Isaiah, need reminded that they can be tempted and lured by the mindset and thoughts of people, then so can I, and so can you. We all can be lured into that thinking, that group mentality that we don't want to be that odd man out. We don't want to be that peculiar person who's sounding a different message in the midst of a completely different kind of thought process that the people had. Isaiah's going to have to stick out in the crowd if he's going to give the testimony of the Lord in the midst of that.
They weren't listening, though.
And ultimately they won't. Ultimately. Some of the kings within it, and there's interesting nuances to it, but generally they don't, and that's why the judgment's coming. Any other thoughts you may have had about that concept, this initial strong arm that's coming on Isaiah? So he's warned not to join this chant. Again, King James, I think, uses the word confederacy. I think probably some translations use the word conspiracy. It's the idea of joining your voice with. That's really the word here. And Isaiah is being told, listen, people are going to want his voice in the mix, right? You think about that. If he's got influence among the people, and you're trying to influence the people, if I can persuade him to join my voice, now what do I have? Yeah, I got a stronger message. Isaiah, there are going to be a lot of people trying to get you to think and say and respond and react like they are, because they can then use your influence among the people to change. Don't think that way. And when they keep trying to get you to join a confederacy or to link up with their conspiring thoughts against Assyria or to join forces with Israel or any other nation along this path, don't buy into that. Don't be persuaded by all that noise of the rulers and people wanting you to conspire with them. Instead, read with me verse 13. Rather than joining your voice with the people, sanctify the Lord. What's that mean, by the way? What's the word sanctify mean? Set apart, right? We're talking about the idea of sanctification meaning to set apart. And so he's challenged here in this text. Sanctify the Lord. Set apart the Lord from all this noise and all these thoughts and all these things that people are trying to get you to consider and to buy into and to adopt into your mindset. Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be what? Yeah, you want to be afraid of something, be afraid of the Lord. Don't be afraid of the guy that's yelling treason, treason. He should be messaging the same thing we are about Assyria. Don't be afraid of the guy who may threaten your life or your well-being or any other aspect of your existence because you won't say what they want you to say. Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself and be afraid of him. Let me ask this question. Is it easy to be, and I'll get to why I'm asking it in a minute, and there's no right or wrong necessarily to what I'm about to say, but is it easy to be afraid of the Lord? I just want you to think about that for a minute. Generally speaking, we tend to be afraid of things that we can what? That we can see. That we can see. We generally are afraid of tangible things, things that are immediate, things that are right in front of me in the moment. And yet, God's presence isn't felt that way, right? He's not visibly seen. We don't interact with him in the same way. He doesn't put fear in us in the same fashion that certain tangible earthly things can do. The fear we have of God has to come because of our belief in what? In him and in his what? In his power. The fear of God that resides in us comes because I believe in him. And I believe the Bible description of him. And I believe the power that he has is real. See, I have to kind of intellectually draw my fear of God. I've got to think about it and come to those conclusions. You come at me with some threat, that's a tangible thing that I can see pretty quickly, and that might very quickly get the heart racing, right? And the fear. So Isaiah, you're going to have to be able to deal with those folks who are coming to you every day. And I imagine as the siege went on and the food got more scarce and the challenges in Jerusalem got worse, I imagine the voices got louder and louder every day. Isaiah, you got to do something about this. You've got to help us through this. You've got to change your mindset about this. And those fears of men are real because they're tangible. Fear of God has to come from faith. And sometimes we struggle with that. So he reminds him, you're going to have a lot of things that are right in front of you that might be scaring you. But let your faith and your convictions and your belief in Jehovah leave you in fear of Him. Let Him be your what? Let Him be your dread. Don't dread, here they come again. Here they come again. They're trying to challenge me again. They're trying to persuade me again. They're going to want me to join this Confederacy again. Don't dread that. Dread what the Lord can do. Be afraid of what God can do. And if you'll do that, if you'll sanctify Him that way, you'll set Him apart, and you'll give Him the proper place of fear and dread, He shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel. It's interesting, right? You sanctify the Lord, you set Him apart in your mind, your thinking, your actions, who you are, what you're about. He'll become a what for you? A sanctuary. So He'll become that secure place of safety. You set Him apart, He'll set you apart, right? You set Him apart, and then He'll set you apart in a place of safety and sanctuary. But that messaging had become what to both houses of Israel? It just became a stumbling block and a rock of offense. God had been over and over and over, prophet after prophet, leader after leader that had any sense, kept coming to both groups of people and saying, listen, if you'll sanctify the Lord, He'll provide you security, safety. He'll bless you. How do you think you have what you have to begin with? Many of the prophets continually reminded them, you didn't get where you're at on your own. God blessed you, provided for you. You set Him apart, He'll set you apart. But He just warns Isaiah ahead of time, there are not going to be a lot of people that accept that. In fact, both Judah and Israel are going to view that as a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And I'll look at that again with you in here in a minute. But to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, a trap. And many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken. Now, where's that? Is there anywhere you think of that idea of stumbling block or rock of offense, that sound familiar at all?
The New Testament.
Okay, so if you go over into 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 8, when they talked about the message of Jesus, Peter spoke of it in the same fashion that Isaiah is being told that they were listening to the testimony of the Lord in his days. The testimony of the Lord in the days of Isaiah to both houses, to Israel and to Judah, had become a rock of offense, a stumbling block. They didn't want to listen to it. It was just problematic for them. Peter said, the message of Jesus for so many had become a rock of offense and a stumbling block. It didn't change the reality that message could save them. But they chose to let it be a stumbling block and a rock of offense. They were bothered by it rather than embracing it and the salvation it afforded. Same thing in Isaiah's day. Rather than embracing it to their benefit, they were rejecting it, and it was creating difficulty for them. I'll pause. Thoughts or comments up to that moment?
Why was it so hard for them to reject it? It didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Just, I don't know.
Why they would turn away, right? But why does anybody? Why do I? You know, when I transgress to the will of the Father, you know, is it? I mean, the simplistic answer to that is self. Generally speaking, all sin kind of is connected to self, right?
Not hard. It wasn't hard.
All right. And it wasn't a matter of understanding; it was a matter of doing, and that hasn't changed even in today. It's not a matter of a lot of times of understanding what God desires. It's just a matter of whether I choose to do it or not. Go ahead, Judy.
Isn't it in other places in the New Testament that Jesus even says He'll be a stumbling block?
And there are some other phrases that hint to that. I think this is the only text that's specific to this phrase that I'm aware of, and unless there's another. I quickly just did a text search in eSword, and those were the Isaiah text and this text were the two that came up. But anyway, there may be others that are similar. But that idea and concept isn't foreign to those who are receiving the message of Jesus.
Well, it does say in the New Testament not to be a stumbling block. Doesn't it?
Right. So that principle is taught that we have to be careful not to be a stumbling block and cause offense to the little ones of Jesus. And so it's adapted in that concept as well at times in terms of the phrase. Use is slightly different, but it is the same phrase. Yeah. 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 Yeah, he is. It's right because he puts this message out, and if they'll run with it, they'll run right to the refuge and safety of the sanctuary. If they resist and run against it, they're actually stumbling over God Himself because they're running in the opposite direction of Him. He becomes that rock of offense, not because that's what He wants to be, but they chose to let Him be that to them because of their resistance against Him. So notice what he says in verse 16. He tells Isaiah, then bind up the testimony and seal the law. So in other words, so if you bind it up, you seal it, what are you doing with it? Yeah, you're finalizing it, right? This is what God has said. You're not turning Him. You're not changing Him. He's at this stage of the messaging, He's not here to debate or to reason or compromise in the sense of them changing His thought processes here. He's simply saying, this is what's going to happen. Seal it up, Isaiah. Bind up the message, because these are the things that are coming. He's heard the instructions and commands of God, and don't think for a minute that you can take away or add, right? That's kind of the Revelation message, but it's the same principle. It's sealed. It's bound. You're not going to add or take away from this testimony of God or the instructions or law that He's giving. It's done. And their job was to embrace it, not try to change it, resist it, or fail as it relates to it. Verse 17. And I think Isaiah turns, this is like a break, if you will, to me in the reading. So, and I will wait upon the Lord, that hideth His face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for Him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. So, after Isaiah hears all this, and he receives all these instructions from the strong hand of the Lord, what's his reaction? Yeah, I'm staying with the Lord. And it's an interesting word. He says, I will wait. He's been given some indication. There'll be a child. Before that child's even thinking about crying, really, this judgment's coming. He gets some of that idea. And so Isaiah says, no matter when God determines, how God determines, all I need to do here is just wait. I'm going to wait upon the Lord that hides His face from the house of Jacob, and I'll look for Him. And behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and wonders. That indicates that there's what? There's more than just him. Okay, there's more than just him. And there generally always are more than just one, right? Who do we usually think of when we think about that? That weeping about me being alone. Elijah, right? We generally think of the prophet Elijah when we think about somebody feeling like they're always alone. And God says that there's still thousands of knees that have not yet bowed to Baal. Don't convince you. You may feel that way sometimes, but don't convince yourself of that. Isaiah just acknowledges it. I'm going to wait on the Lord no matter what he decides and how he decides to do it. I'll watch for him, and I and the children whom the Lord hath given me, those faithful believers, those who commit themselves to what God has said, will be a sign and for wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. We're going to be a visible example of what you do when the Lord gives you instructions to follow. And no matter what others may say, think, react, or do, we're going to be that living example. Great lesson, by the way, right? I think sometimes we get swallowed up by the world we live in, and we convince ourselves that our example can't or won't have any real impact or value on the world in which we live. Not true. The world in which Isaiah lived was wicked from top to bottom, right? The world of Isaiah was wicked from top to bottom. Every form of idolatry and sinful pursuit you could imagine. They oppressed the poor. There was just wickedness at every turn in the days of Isaiah. And yet he says, myself and those who are following the Lord with me will be a sign and a wonder to the nation. Just be that. Know that you're not really alone, though at times we feel it. There are still others, part of a remnant, who are striving to serve God. And never devalue, no matter how wicked the world may appear, never devalue what one good example within a group setting can be as it relates to that. So he reminds him, don't be tempted in verses 19 and 20 when they suggest he consult wizards and soothsayers, right? They're going to come and say, well, I know God said this, but why don't you go talk to this guy over here? He's had a few visions, or why don't you go talk to him? And he says it's God that they need to be listening to. And it's interesting, he uses the phrase, he alone is living, right? He says he's the living one. The others are dead. They can pray to an idol all day long, and they'll get nothing from it. You need to be focusing your attentions on the living among the dead idols and all the soothsayers and the wizards and those who are just turning to anything they can think of to try to convince the people to turn from God's will. To the law, he said, verse 20, and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it is because there is what? No light in them. Anyone who claims to be a presenter of God's light, saying something contrary to the light of his message, is really in darkness. They can proclaim and testify all kinds of things. But Isaiah is told, if they do not speak according to this word, the message that I've delivered, the testimony that you bound, the law that you've sealed, if they don't speak in those languages and in that terminology and with those words that came from God, there's no light in them. Why would I rely upon them then, right? That's the idea. Why would you trust it? If it didn't come from God, it's out of darkness, and there's no reason that we should consider those thoughts.
Are men doing that today?
It hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped, right? And folks who turn to anything but what God has actually shared and delivered. And if they reject it, at the end of the chapter, he said the testimony of God, they will turn to all manner of things when they're troubled. They've already put aside God, right? They've already put aside Him. At the end of the phrase, I think he says they are driven to darkness. And the reason why they're driven to darkness is they've turned away from what? The light. The only light is God. The only real light that benefits them is God. And if they've turned away from Him, they've turned to darkness. Because He's the only true light that there is. And so he tells Isaiah, tell them, stay grounded in His Word. Because you turn to anything else but God, you've turned to things that will only lead you to darkness. Thoughts, questions up to the end of the chapter there. Go ahead, Bill.
This reminds me a little bit of King Saul. He was troubled because of the popularity of David.
Yeah.
And he had outlawed witches and mediums. And all. But he
Yeah.
goes to the witch of Endor.
Yeah.
And he was there a while, and she said, wait a minute, you're Saul.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be.
You're not supposed to be here. Yeah, it is amazing how, and I think that's kind of what God's warning Isaiah about here. In your heart, you may know these things, but there's going to be a lot of temptation and persuasion for you to turn to other things. And Saul's a perfect example of that. Any other thoughts? Quickly, I'll run those questions that are based out of chapter 8, if you have that big outline that we shared with you. And I've got more of those back there if you don't have one of those, by the way. But what was the name of Isaiah's second son, and what does it mean? Go ahead, pronounce that. Go ahead. Go ahead. Anyone? Anyone want to take that on? Yeah, right. But it meant spoils, right, in that context. What would happen before the child was old enough to know his parents? That's right. So this judgment upon even other nations would come. Why would this desolation come upon Judah in verse 6? They weren't adhering to what God had been sharing and delivering to them. Anything else you might have had? What did God tell Isaiah he should do? Yeah, he's going to have to be patient and stick to the Lord. To those who heeded the Lord, what would he be? All right, so he said, sanctify the Lord. That was the first part. And he would become a sanctuary to them. And to those who did not, the message would become a stumbling block and a rock of offense. And he didn't give it much else choice, right? It was just kind of, embrace it, sanctify the Lord, and He'll provide refuge. Reject it, and you'll just turn it into a stumbling block and a rock of offense against you. To whom was Isaiah not to turn? We just say that's the witches, the wizards, the soothsayers, the people the divinations that they might reach out to supposedly. But ultimately, he said the reasoning for that was because all those things are really what? Dead. Why would you turn to the dead when you've got the living God you can turn to? Why would you turn to something that's darkness when you've got the light of God available to you? And that seems to be the closing messaging there within the chapter. All right, so Lord willing, we'll come back to chapter 9, into chapter 9 next week.